Good morning. I'm Cornell Overfield, an analyst at the Strategy and Policy Analysis Program at CNA. On behalf of our President and CEO, Catherine McGrady, I'd like to welcome you to this virtual National Security Seminar, the first of our 2022 series. Before we begin, a few administrative notes. Today's event is on the record. A recording will be available on our site, and we'll follow up with a link if you would like to share it with any colleague who could not join us today. Each panelist will present some opening remarks before we jump into a moderated discussion. After about 30 minutes, we'll give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. We encourage you to send your questions. If you're participating through Zoom, please send a question through the Q&A feature. If you're calling in, you can send them to cna_nss@cna.org, which is the same email address that sent you the dial-in information for today's event. Now, this is your first acquaintance with CNA. Let me tell you a little bit about ourselves. We're a nonprofit research organization comprised of the Center for Naval Analyses and the Institute for Public Research. The Center for Naval Analyses is the federally funded research and development center for the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, but our work supports decision makers across the Department of Defense and other U.S. government agencies. Our Institute for Public Research supports homeland security and infrastructure protection, public safety, public health preparedness and response, and emergency operations at all levels of government. The National Security Seminar Series is a CNA initiative to bring together thought leaders from across the U.S. government, academic and research institutions, the private sector, and U.S. partner nations to share their expertise, facilitate dialogue, and contribute to an ongoing conversation about issues affecting U.S. and partner national security. Our theme for this year's series is Mobilizing Cooperation to Advance National Security. Competition has been the defining paradigm shaping U.S. national security in recent years, but cooperation, both international and domestic, has become increasingly critical to meeting national security challenges. Effective cooperation across the interagency and between the private and public sectors will be needed to safeguard homeland security. As the Department of Defense implements integrated deterrence, it will need to work with other departments to integrate the instruments of U.S. national power and coordinate between the armed services, combatant commands, allies, and partners to deter adversaries across theaters and the spectrum of conflict. In 2022, the National Security Seminar Series will focus on the difficulties of and opportunities for cooperation in the face of enduring challenges such as climate change and deterrence, and emerging threats like new technologies, supply chain disruptions, the global health crises, and of course, wars of aggression in Europe. The series will examine the role of cooperation in national security and how the U.S. can most effectively mobilize partnerships to enhance its national security. Today's discussion takes a look at the People's Republic of China's economic activity in the Arctic and the implications and opportunities for the United States and Europe. CNA has a robust body of work on both Arctic affairs and PRC economic statecraft in other regions. We'll share links to some of that work if you're interested, both in the chat and by email. In this case, CNA built on this past work for a series of congressionally mandated reports on PRC investment in the Arctic and the national security implications thereof. We're joined today by two of the report's authors, Mark Rosen and Heidi Holz. Mark Rosen serves as Senior Vice President and General Counsel at CNA. He's an expert in maritime law and policy, maritime arms control, the Arctic, and regulation of the global commons, international law and treaties, the law of armed conflict, and homeland security. Mark's recent work includes analyses of conflicting maritime claims in the South China Sea, East China Sea, Bay of Bengal, the Arctic, and the Gulf of Guinea, and governance gaps that create vulnerabilities in space, cyberspace, and the Arctic. Rosen is a retired Navy captain who served with the Navy Judge Advocate General Corps as an international law attorney and military planner. Heidi Holz is a senior research scientist in the China Studies program at CNA. Her research interests include China's media environment, PRC maritime policies and activities, particularly those related to the South China Sea, Chinese military doctrine and operations, as well as the U.S.-China military-to-military relations. Before joining CNA, Holz was a biodefense analyst and China specialist, with the Division of Integrated Biodefense at Georgetown University's Imaging, Science, and Information Systems Center. She also worked at the Voice of America's Mandarin service. We're also extremely honored to have with us today Ambassador Michael Mann, the European Union's Ambassador at Large for the Arctic, who will share the perspective of our allies and partners in Europe. Ambassador Michael Mann is, as I mentioned, the EU's Ambassador at Large for the Arctic, Previously, Ambassador Mann spent 3 years as the EU's ambassador to Iceland. Between 2011 and 2017, he was the head of strategic communications at the European External Action Service, where he served as chief spokesperson to High Representative Catherine Ashton from 2011 to 2014. Ambassador Mann worked as a European Commission spokesperson between 2002 and 2011, covering a wide range of portfolios. He began his career in Brussels as a journalist, working for the Financial Times, Reuters, and Bloomberg News, among others. We'll now turn to the opening remarks section of our discussion today. The way this will work is each of these speakers will have a roughly 5 or 6 minute prepared comment based on their expertise and in the case of Heidi Holz and Mark Rosen, the research that CNA has conducted, but also at the end addressing of course, the elephant in the room, as it were, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that's unfolding before all our eyes. So at the close of those 3 5 or 6 minute introductory remarks, we'll turn to a few questions from me to spur a bit of discussion, and hopefully the combination of those remarks and the conversation that ensues will spark questions of your own that you can then share through the Q&A function in the chat or via email, as mentioned before. So without any further ado, I invite Mark Rosen to deliver his prepared remarks. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cornell. And I saw the RSVP list. I saw a number of friends that I've met along the way in this sort of journey to try to understand what's happening in the Arctic. I can't go into too much detail given the short time allotted in terms of what the FDI report is, the details of that report, and that was my portion of the most recent research effort by CNA. But what I want to do is sort of put that most recent research, which of course is available on the web, into context. And then also I want to conclude with a couple of remarks about where things might go given what's currently happening with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Turning back to 2013, myself and another CNA analyst were commissioned by Stanford University's Hoover Institute to do an assessment of the gaps in Arctic governance, given climatic conditions, new waterways, and increased research and development. And the conclusion of that report was that given the initial trends in mining and oil and gas, that indeed there were governance gaps, particularly because there was very little infrastructure there to address any type of incident that might occur. The risks from an oil spill in particular were particularly acute to deal with the costs of cleanup as well as the cost of claims. And if there was an accident and it involved multiple states, the result would be very uncertain, but there would certainly be a lot of finger pointing. But that report, and I can say this as the author, fell short of quantifying the extent to which this was really a problem. In other words, are we dealing with just 1 or 2 little projects in the Arctic, or is there a trend? The next chapter in the saga was a 2017 report, which tried to get a handle on the actual investment activity, and so that you could put this risk discussion in context. The principal focus of that study, which was released in 2017, was upon Chinese investment. I might also say that that report was issued about 2 months before China issued its Arctic white paper, in which China asserted that its interest in the Arctic went beyond that of a consumer of the commodities that were produced or harvested in the Arctic on the open market, as well as just simply a transit state. They said that their interests were greater than that. In any event, we did the best we could with limited data sources to try to get a handle. And indeed, the data that we were able to adduce said that China was indeed a player, serious player in a number of new industries, oil and gas, minerals, and infrastructure. And of course, also we did an assessment of to what extent there were good systems in place to assess and characterize investments to ensure that they met OECD and other standards. And indeed, we concluded that in some states, the systems, like especially the United States, were good. Screening mechanisms were good, and others, they were somewhat wanting. So what we found was there are about 800 total transactions, totaling about $90 billion north of 60 degrees. We had some difficulty because of the way states map their transactions. Some of them, for example, in the United States, they report FDI on a national level, on a national basis. So the numbers were a bit squishy. However, very comfortable in that report and saying that as based on the policy statements of China, as well as just basic economics, that China is a net importer of a lot of materials, including energy, that it made a lot of sense that China was going to continue to be a very large economic player in the Arctic. And, obviously we carried with it a concern that China not go the way of other regions. And then came the NDAA tasking in 2020, which was indeed shaped by the 2017 report. Now, this study envisioned field work to corroborate findings to corroborate the deals that one could find in corporate filings or reported in the financial press, to gain insights into the true scope of the investment activities and whether such things as labor or environmental standards were being met. Then, this is 2019, we had a little difficulty getting the matter under contract, and then COVID struck, which effectively meant that the region was sort of shut down to us being able to do that field work. We did do about 45 interviews, but in the main, that 2017 report was far less dramatic in terms of showing a trend. A number of deals had been walked back. A lot of deals that had been previously reported never went to fruition. And in some cases, the nations had pushed back on potential deals that China was interested in developing. Basic conclusions were true FDI does not appear to be increasing overall. But there are other types of transaction in which China had been increasing its profile, particularly as a supplier. China had made major investments in the oil and gas area, Yamal in particular, but major new investments had fallen off. And here I believe price was a major factor, because back then, oil was in less than $50 a barrel. Now, of course, the situation is different. And our conclusion also was that their strategy suggested a continued upward investment trend, particularly if you can link that to some of their larger BRI types of initiatives, Belts and Road Initiative. And you might see a lot of infrastructure investment in the Northern Sea Route, as well as the Northwest Passage. Now, China had made some major investments in the area of 5G, as well as undersea cables. And lastly, of course, we concluded that there is the potential, with a lot of money going up there, that money can translate into political influence. Now, my own personal view is that in addition, there was some political pushback, but the fact of COVID, it blunted a lot of those deals that were going to go through, because a lot of business deals are based on a handshake and a personal relationship. And so, the question is, that it would be great to know now whether those deals, some of those deals which were in a hiatus status, are likely to go forward. So that brings me to the last sort of piece. Could you show the slide, Doug? Where are we likely to go? What can we likely see in the future? Well, obviously, if we're talking about oil and gas, I mean, you can see it at the gas pump today. At one point last week, oil was $130 a barrel. I think now it's around about 110. So I think that's going to increase the focus on the oil and gas sector. And up to now, for example, in the case of Yamal, France's Total is still in that deal as a major investment in Yamal LNG, and they have not said that they're going to exit. However, if the sanctions take hold and they apply to France, then it's hard to say how that's going to play out. In contrast, BP and Shell have both announced that they are dumping their interest in joint Rosneft and Gazprom projects. So what does that mean? It means there's going to be large amounts of capital stock that's going to be that's going to be available. And it would seem to me that it would make a lot of sense that China might try to pick up a lot of that. And also they might try to do that, and that may stimulate other things like their belts and road types of investments, as I said, in the Northern Sea Route and in the Northwest Passage. Also, I think you will see that Yamal, given the fact that it's oil, it's mostly oil, mostly gas, but also some oil. It's being mined in it, or it's being extracted in an area where it's moving by sea. It's not going via pipeline over a country which might be considered to be, from Russia's perspective, hostile to its interests. So, I mean, 1 year ago, if you'd asked me what is the likely prospect of this, given the price, the significant price rise, before, it didn't make a heck of a lot of sense for people to invest in oil and gas extraction in the Arctic because of the cost, the degree of difficulty of trying to do extraction in an Arctic environment. And so I think in the last analysis, it would be naive to count to count China out. And I think that you may see some renewed economic activity, and that the current crisis could provide the catalyst for them to do so. And given that, there were various recommendations in the report about increasing access to capital for the Arctic nations. Certainly those should be, and also better mechanisms to be able to screen inbound FDI. And I think those need to be given serious consideration. Cornell, back to you.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that overview, Mark. Did a masterful job of connecting the genesis of these reports to the findings, of course, the context of the past few years, and what we recommend, or what the analysis leads us to recommend here at CNA. I'm left with many questions. I'm sure the audience is as well. But before we turn to those, I'd like to turn the floor over to Ms. Heidi Holz to speak to her expertise about Chinese objectives and strategy when it comes to the Arctic. Heidi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cornell. And if I could trouble you to share that slide, please. I find it helpful to have something to look at when I'm talking. In the context of that larger project that we all worked on, my goal was to identify China's strategic objectives in the Arctic and the ways that Beijing pursues them, and then situate PRC FDI within that larger context. So what will likely come as no surprise to many of you in the audience today is that Beijing has been loud and clear about the fact that it has strategic ambitions in the Arctic. 4 years ago, as Mark just mentioned, the State Council Information Office released an official white paper titled China's Arctic Policy. And that document articulated specific policy objectives, which I've included on the slide, but it didn't necessarily tell us why China has these policy objectives and how it sees the Arctic fitting into its larger strategy. To get a sense of how the Arctic fit into the larger strategic puzzle for Beijing, we had to take a step back and look at the totality of PRC behavior and rhetoric related to the region. And then when we did that, it became apparent that PRC leaders see the Arctic as important to achieving their vision for China, the China dream of national rejuvenation, in which the country is returned to its former glory as a political, cultural, and economic power. PRC leaders see the Arctic as important to building what they refer to as a community with a shared future for mankind. That's the slogan that they use to refer to an international system that's been restructured in ways that suit China's interests and afford it great power status. PRC policy documents describe the Arctic as part of that community. And all of the policy objectives articulated in the white paper align with the three overarching objectives that I've listed on the slide that are on the screen for you to see: sustaining economic development, defending national sovereignty, security, and development interests, and reforming the global system to align with PRC interests. In terms of sustaining economic development, China's leaders recognize the value of the Arctic's abundant energy and mineral resources and potentially Arctic shipping routes. In terms of China's national security interests, PLA, or Chinese military strategic thinkers, have noted several reasons that the Arctic is important to China's security objectives, including the deterrent value of deploying nuclear missiles to the Arctic and the fact that Arctic shipping routes offer potential alternatives to choke points like the Suez and Panama Canals and the Strait of Malacca. And finally, gaining a voice in Arctic governance lines up with the PRC objective of reforming the global system to align with PRC interests. Now, these objectives span the dime, and to pursue them, Beijing employs multiple elements of state power. To date, Beijing's efforts have relied on the diplomatic, economic, and informational elements of state power, not so much the military. Here I would note, though, that although the PLA doesn't appear to play an active or at least a public role in the Arctic at the moment, China is building capacity, pre-positioning capabilities, and developing familiarity with the operating environment that could enable future PLA operations there. But at the moment, economic tools play a really unique role in Beijing's efforts to advance its interests in the Arctic. As a non-Arctic state, China depends on the states in the region to give it access, and one of the easiest ways to get that access is to buy it. Chinese firms with deep pockets and state backing are uniquely positioned to take on large, risky Arctic projects. Among the economic tools at Beijing's disposal, FDI appears to be a key tool that Chinese entities use to secure rights and access, particularly to natural resources, and to develop the infrastructure to support the future commercial use of Arctic shipping routes. Now, here it's important to note that perhaps unsurprisingly, Beijing has several mechanisms for ensuring that the investments of both state-owned and private Chinese companies further Beijing's interests. In recent years, the party state has issued guidance and regulations aimed at tightening control over the overseas investments of PRC firms. Excuse me. Despite China's wide-ranging efforts to pursue its objectives in the Arctic, I think it's really, really important to point out that its success to date has been limited due to a number of challenges, COVID aside. First, there's been pushback from Arctic states. Several Arctic states, including Finland, Denmark, and Canada, have blocked Chinese investments because of security concerns. Even PRC efforts to cooperate with Russia have been constrained by domestic politics. It remains to be seen how the conflict in Ukraine is going to affect the potential for cooperation there. That's certainly an issue worth watching. Second, Beijing hasn't done itself any favors by employing economic coercion against Norway, Sweden, and Canada. In fact, this has severely undermined its efforts to promote a positive image of its role in the Arctic. Third is the fact that despite Beijing's influence, Chinese companies are still commercial enterprises looking to turn a profit. And there's evidence to suggest that some have balked at the apparent lack of profitability of Arctic ventures. And finally, a number of Chinese investment projects in the Arctic appear to have stalled. As Mark mentioned, that could be partly an artifact of COVID. And key among these is the Arkhangelsk port. The end result is that China still lacks access to Arctic ports that it has worked so hard to get. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I turn the floor back over to Cornell.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Heidi. I see that we have questions already coming in, and I encourage folks to continue to add questions to our question and answer panel here in Zoom. I now turn to our honored guest, Ambassador Mann, for his remarks on the comments that have come before and his perspective from the European Union, particularly given the European Union's recent moves in the Arctic and recent publication of the new strategy. I think we'll all have quite a bit to learn, and I'm quite interested to hear what you have to say, Ambassador. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Cornell. Apologies to everyone for my slightly croaky voice. I actually had a positive COVID test this morning for the first time, so but I don't feel bad. I just got a rather curious voice, but I'll try not to cough too much. Thanks very much indeed for inviting me. I'm very honoured to be here, such a high-class panel. And I don't want to repeat what Mark and Heidi have said, but just give you a little bit of perspective from the European Union side. We published a new policy document, as Cornell said, in October last year. And one thing that a lot of people noticed in was there wasn't a great deal of mention of China. That was not sort of deliberately swerving the issue of China, more that we tried to sort of give a positive, if you like, a positive approach of what the European Union likes to do in the Arctic, rather than taking a look and speculating too much about the ambitions of others. But clearly China has been, as Mark originally mentioned, I mean, they mentioned themselves as a near Arctic state in their policy paper, which is a curious concept right from the word go. If you look at the way China regards the South China Sea, it's being its own waters, and then at the same time it appears to believe that freedom of navigation for all is the way in the Arctic waters. That shows a level of inconsistency that we're concerned about. Clearly, as far as Arctic relations are concerned, a legal framework is the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. China has shown let's say, a flexible attitude towards that. So we are sort of keeping our eye on developments as far as China are concerned. I think it's fair to say they've probably moved into the Arctic in a slightly more softly way than they have in other parts of the world, but that doesn't mean that their ambitions aren't equally large. They have added the Polar Silk Road to their Belt and Road Initiative, and as Mark and Heidi said, there's been investment attempts, but also real investments in many parts of Europe. There's, whether it be cables, whether it be in attempts to invest in ports. I was previously the EU ambassador in Iceland, and there was an attempt to invest in a deep water port, because what China is mostly interested in is, of course, energy resources, and of course transport routes to get them out of the Arctic. And of course, if you look at the reality of the Northern Sea route, it's of great interest to Russia and to China, but European shippers actually haven't really used it much, because no matter how much the ice may be melting, it is still a hazardous route, and it is still an uncertain route in terms of timing. European shippers prefer to know that their goods will arrive at port at a certain day, and that they'll be able to stop off on ports on the way. So there's a different model there. Clearly, we've also seen occasional Chinese military vessels turning up in the Arctic just to show their presence. We have overall with the Chinese a relationship of strategic competition, strategic rivalry, but also we have to cooperate with them. But as far as we are concerned, the basis for our dealings with China, they have to, I suppose, a cliche, put their money where their mouth is. They need to adhere to the legal frameworks that are there. They talk a good game about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They need to put their money where their mouth is there. And of course, to a certain extent, there's not much we can do about China investing in the Arctic regions. They've already invested heavily in Russian LNG for the reasons I set out before. And in fact, when the European Union and the US introduced sanctions against Russia following the annexation of Crimea, the Russians looked immediately to China for investment. So it's picking up. I guess I should also mention from the European Union perspective, in our policy paper, obviously Mark pointed out the potentialities for investment in oil and gas in Arctic waters and on land. Now, you might have noticed that in our policy paper, we rather daringly proposed that there should be an end to drilling for new oil and gas in Arctic waters, but also generally around the world, and that we would seek a moratorium with our partners on further future drilling. This hasn't won us many friends, but I think if you look at the way things are turning, although as Mark says, clearly the price is going up, I think the writing is on the wall for hydrocarbons. Even the Russians accept or realize that 60% of their country is built on permafrost, which is thawing because of global warming. So there is I think, the European Union's main interest here is to get a serious discussion started amongst people, because we have to make a double shift away from hydrocarbons and towards green energies, for which you need minerals. And that, again, that's where China will possibly come in as well. We say in our policy paper that there needs to be investment in green minerals. Unfortunately, there hasn't been much interest from European companies thus far, and we've seen a lot of Chinese interest there. But we are hoping that we can, give a steer to our businesses, and that we can insist on these minerals being mined with the highest social and environmental standards, and that we can become more strategically independent from countries like China for these minerals, which will be absolutely vital if we're serious about the green transition. You also asked me to talk about FDI. Now, we have a FDI screening regulation in the European Union that came into force not very long ago. I have to be honest, in the Arctic context, its scope is fairly limited. That basically it applies on European Union territory only, so it doesn't apply, for example, in Greenland, or even in the two countries, Norway and Iceland, that have are members of the single market, but not actually members of the European Union. And it does have certain strict criteria. It has to show that particular investment has a particularly detrimental effect on certain European projects and programs, and has a genuine security disadvantages for us. So it's relatively limited. The good thing is that we are working together with the US on implementing this, and there is a mechanism in there for cooperation on that. The other question you asked me to look at is, how the US and the EU can work together to sort of try and encourage sustainable economic growth in Arctic regions. We already do so in our policy document. Clearly, the European Union has to be very careful about where its legal competences lie. We have powers over some things, but not others. But we do invest extremely heavily in regional development aid in northern Finland and Sweden. We pay 30 million euros every year to Greenland to pay for their education system. We have invested 300 million euros over the last 7 years in Arctic and polar research. So we're busily investing there. But I think talking to my counterparts in the State Department and other parts of the US system, there is very much an interest in further cooperation between us. We all have the same goals. And I think we're going to come on, obviously, to how Ukraine has changed the outlook, security outlook in the Arctic regions. But certainly until now, all the 8 Arctic states, even though we disagreed with Russia on many, many things, had common goals: sustainable development, keeping the Arctic peaceful and prosperous. Clearly, the invasion of Ukraine has changed the situation markedly, and I think perhaps I'll leave it there, because I could talk about this for the next half hour. But maybe let's move on to that in the Q&A session. But the message from the European Union is that we think we need to make a shift in terms of economic output from the Arctic sooner rather than later. And we are in the market for sharing and working together with our like-minded partners, and hopefully excluding Russia to the max because of what they've done.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ambassador Mann, for that splendid overview of the European Union's policy in the Arctic, and that very direct and to the point addressing of the questions that we discussed over email. Thank you for hitting those. Very much appreciated. Now let's spend the next maybe 10 or so minutes in our moderator facilitated discussion between the panelists, and then as these questions continue to flow in, we'll have a great many to choose from, and we can turn to those for the last third of our discussion today. So I'd like to start off by, again, obviously the report was written and published well before the events that we're all witnessing in Ukraine. So I know Heidi and Mark and I, as a fellow co-author of the report, all have these long-term trends in mind, these long-term objectives in Heidi's case for the PRC in the Arctic. I'd like to turn, though, to the sharp disruption of Ukraine and focus in on that a little bit more. I know we've all have hit on that to some degree. So one element is the we can approach this perhaps from both the price disruption side of things. I know, Mark, you've talked about that, and we have a question about how the decline in prices or the decline in certain value of Arctic projects could affect those projects in the Arctic, given the high cost of doing business in the Arctic. But also I'd like to address, and Heidi, perhaps you can hit this question. I thought one of the most interesting findings, in my opinion, not being a China hand by any stretch of the imagination, was your finding that price motives and profitability play an important role in limiting the realization of PRC official objectives. I was wondering if perhaps, I know it's early days yet, but could you perhaps hazard a guess as to how the West's sanctions on Russia may affect Chinese firms if China were to, say, decide that it doesn't want to couple themselves to Russia? How would Chinese firms navigate this, or how might they navigate this? What could the audience and the rest of us look for as telltale signs? Perhaps we can start there.
That's a big question. I could write a report on that. Give me a moment to think for a second. I think, and I want to clarify, I'm not sure that it's been a major constraint on Chinese investment in the Arctic to date, that companies are balking. We just came across some anecdotal evidence that that is a concern when they perceive these some of these projects as not necessarily profitable from their perspective when they're encouraged to undertake them. That said, and I honestly, I can't say for certain how big a factor that is or has been. That said, there are mechanisms, or Beijing has policy guidance that it can issue to encourage investment in sectors. I imagine that subsidies can be offered. There are probably a variety of mechanisms that, should they decide to go forward with some of these projects, despite the near-term lack of profitability, they could strongly encourage companies to go ahead and move forward. I'm not sure that that's a satisfying answer, but that's the best I've got at the moment.
Maybe I could help you a little bit. Particularly in the 2017 report, it seemed to us that a lot of deals were being undertaken by China because they were very interested in securing long-term sources of supply. And it was a classic hedge strategy, and price was less of a factor. But then again, price for oil and minerals was far less than it is today. But towards the end, we were starting to see creep into some of their calculus the idea that we need to show return on investment. I mean, when I talked about the 2017 report, I said effectively China has taken the default risk off the table. That said, if you look at the latest report that we did, the financing instruments through China Exim and some of their other financing mechanisms makes it, and their ability to spread out repayment terms over many, many years, more than a traditional US Exim loan. I mean, the Chinese still have a lot of firepower in their financial toolkit that they can use, which can make it attractive for investment in that region. But yeah, I agree, Cornell and Heidi, that increasingly you're seeing that the people with the green eye shades in the controller's office in the Chinese companies are saying, hey, we've got to realize an investment. One other comment too, I mean, if we get to the point where you're actually going to have shortages, then I think, the national policy will kick in and say, hey, we need to ensure that we have adequate supplies of oil and gas and minerals to be able to feed our factories. And I don't think we're at that point yet. But I think that, if there are genuine shortages, then I think you may see instances in which China will move to be more aggressive in trying to secure long-term leases and other sorts of sources of supply. Cornell?
Just a little point from me maybe there. Certainly when the sanctions came in after the annexation of Crimea, that in a way, I mean, the technology and the money wasn't coming in from European sources anymore. And they very much turned the Russians to China as a sort of replacement. I suppose, we have far more severe sanctions now, thank goodness, following the latest outrage. And it's part of the question is whether China can actually provide the kind of technology and expertise that they are currently getting from Western sources. That's rather doubtful, I think.
Thank you, Ambassador Mann, and thank you, Mark and Heidi, for this comprehensive answer from all of our panelists to that question that I know is quite tricky, but that's why they assembled the three of you. So thought we did a good job of answering that one. I want to turn to a different kind of sanction. We've talked a lot about economic sanctions. Perhaps before we turn to the Q&A session, we can talk about diplomatic sanctions and how those affect the diplomatic calculus for the US and its partners. Obviously, the Arctic Council, that sort of bastion of inter-Arctic cooperation among the 8 Arctic states, has now been disrupted given as a consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The other 7 Arctic states, for those who are unaware, have essentially suspended their participation in the Arctic Council since Russia currently has the chair of the Arctic Council, so any meetings would have to take place in Russia. Obviously, that's a major blow to international cooperation in the Arctic, at least symbolically. But perhaps, Ambassador Mann, you could start us off talking a little bit about what that might mean practically, particularly as the EU becomes more active in the Arctic, and the US and other countries turn their eye or put a little bit more attention towards the Arctic and the economic and diplomatic issues at stake there. What opportunities might the suspension of the Arctic Council create, or is it purely a downside risk for the US and its partners?
Well, clearly action had to be taken. We were basically isolating Russia across the world and across fora in every sphere we could find. And so it was quite right that the same should apply to the Arctic Council. Russia is the biggest Arctic state by far. It gets a large proportion of its economy out of the Arctic. But there's a lot more to Arctic and Northern cooperation than the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council is an organization that deals with certain issues. It's more about the soft issues. It's not on security. It's not so much on the economic side either. It's more on the sort of environmental, the rights of the peoples of the Arctic. So, but the interesting thing is that the work of the Arctic Council, it has a number of working groups which do really useful work. We, as the EU, are not members of the Arctic Council because we're not an Arctic state. We're not a state, and we're not even formally observers because the Russians are blocking us. But we are de facto observers. We have the same rights of observers. And what is interesting is, in fact, that under the auspices of the Arctic Council, there's currently something like 130 projects ongoing. And in fact, Russia is active in very few of them. So I think the key here is that the other 7, they've said they're not sending any delegates to Russia, which is quite right, and not engaging with Russia. However, what they are looking at now is to try and find ways to keep the Arctic cooperation active and to keep it going amongst the 7. And, those outside who also play a role like ourselves, because it is very important, because the Arctic is not just a big piece of ice. It's a place where 4 to 5 million people live. They have jobs. They need to have economic prospects. The place is melting 3 times faster than the rest of the planet, heating up 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. There's work that needs to be done. So while we're excluding Russia, we're very much in the market for keeping the Arctic cooperation going. Added to that, the Arctic Council is not the only international Arctic forum. It's the big circumpolar one, but we do a lot of Barents cooperation. We have a number of different groupings where the European Union is actually a full member and where we do good work. So the buzzword here is exclude Russia, but make sure that the good work of Arctic cooperation can continue. And it's early days yet, so we're working out how to do that. But the European Union, for example, works through all these fora but also has its own programs, and we're certainly going to keep them going because we need to continue the work. And fortunately, the Arctic is gaining so much more attention these days that people are realizing the importance of continuing with this. I'll leave it there, perhaps.
Could I make one additional comment, Cornell?
Please go ahead, Mark.
I understand the current need to isolate Russia, but I think we should not lose sight of the fact that the Arctic is a maritime region, and most of the development that's going to take place in the Arctic is going to be taking place near the water. And if you have an industrial accident, whatever happens, any pollution, if you have an oil slick, it doesn't recognize national boundaries. And so you could have a oil spill near Yamal and it'll wash up on the shores of Alaska, depending on the currents. So I say that only because one way or another, we probably need to help secure Russia's cooperation in the management of resources there, because it could have, if the development that takes place, mining, because remember, there's very few pipelines up there and almost no roads. So if stuff goes in and out, it's going to go by sea. So if shipping is imprudent, if industrial practices at oil and gas facilities, handling facilities, mines is imprudent, then the victim in all that's going to be the marine environment. And that is horrible for everybody, including very large fisheries. Over, Cornell.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Ambassador Mann. Heidi, I know that this is outside of or adjacent to, or perhaps not directly related to the subject that you studied for the report, but I'm curious, obviously the People's Republic of China put a great deal of stock in becoming an observer to the Arctic Council. Have you happened to see anything in recent days about China's reaction to the actions of the Arctic Seven, as it were, ostracizing Russia? And do you have any sense of how this might affect China's use of the Arctic Council for its sort of to legitimize its presence and activities in the Arctic?
I have not seen anything, or nothing's come across my desk, but I will say that, I mean, Russia's actions in Ukraine have put Beijing in a strategic bind in a number of ways, right? Far-reaching impact of this. And the Arctic is just one example of that. So I imagine that China will want to continue to leverage its position as an observer on the Arctic Council as much as it can continue to do so. That's part of its effort to secure a voice for itself in Arctic affairs. How much of a tightrope it's going to have to walk to avoid losing that status because of its alignment with Russia is an open question, right? That's probably something that is one of many things that is affecting China's strategic calculus right now with regard to how much they want to be seen as aligned with Russia in the current conflict.
Thanks so much for that terrific answer, Heidi. And Ambassador Mann, I'm just going to pop back to you quite quickly for hopefully a technical clarification. Do you happen to know how involved China is, if at all, in those many sort of subcomponent projects that you were speaking about that Russia is largely closed out of? Is the same true for China?
To be quite honest with you, I don't have my finger on the figures exactly, but I mean, I think it's important to not to overstate the role that observers have in the Arctic Council. This is an organization that's run entirely by the Arctic states and the representatives of the indigenous peoples. And we can, for example, the European Union and also China, we do make a major contribution in the financing and in providing the expertise to some of the scientific groups that they have. But really and truly, the Arctic Council is run by and for the people who are in the Arctic. So China, there's been a lot of speculation. Would China actually be happy with the current governance structures, and would it try and bypass them in some way? Let's hope not. But you know, it's a law unto itself in many ways, China. At the moment, they're being fairly soft on this, but you never know what is around the corner, because they don't think that they can achieve major aims through trying to steer the Arctic Council, to be honest.
Terrific, thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot there with the technical clarification, but greatly appreciate your insight there. So let's turn now to the the Q&A, excuse me, Q&A portion of our event today for the next 20 minutes or so. Again, thank you to everyone who has submitted a question in our Q&A box. I highly encourage you to do so if you have a question, so that we can consider it and package it into an omnibus question for our panelists, or ask it as a standalone question. So let's begin with those. I'm seeing a lot of questions about the Silk Road and the global gateway. In particular, a couple questions juxtaposing the two, or suggesting that perhaps the global gateway is a response, the European Union's response to the Silk Road in general, the Belt and Road project initiative in general, the Polar Silk Road to a certain extent. Heidi, I'm wondering, and Ambassador Mann, this seems like a question for the two of you to hash out, perhaps in combination, in conversation. Would you like to take a stab at that?
Heidi, please go ahead. I can if you want. I can if you want.
I defer to you, honestly. Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, when we unveiled our global gateway, which is for those that don't know, it's a sort of an attempt to stimulate big infrastructure projects through public-private partnerships. In a nutshell, obviously, the obvious response of many people was that it was us kind of, you know, wringing our hands and responding to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, I think if that were the case, we would have done this a long time ago. I think this is a genuine attempt to you know, fill some of the infrastructure gaps that we feel we have on the European continent, and it's better that we do it ourselves rather than allow Chinese to do it, to be quite honest. So that's a very sort of simplistic but probably truthful answer for you.
Terrific, thank you, Ambassador Mann, for that answer. Mark, I think this is one that is in your wheelhouse. We have a question about whether, prior to completely open routes through the Arctic, some maritime routes, what role do you see for government and icebreaker ships with incentivizing economic development? Do you see a scenario where the private sector will more fully develop icebreaking capability?
Well, I not along the Northern Sea Route. I mean, the Russian Northern Sea Route Authority already has a very sizable icebreaker fleet, and they are pretty effectively looped into that system. And those icebreakers are quite robust. I mean, in talking to insurers, in Norway, they recognize the value of that sort of integrated approach in the Northern Sea Route between, you know, a permitting system and icebreakers. Not so much to always break ice, but because if a ship goes through the Northern Sea Route and its propeller hits ice, the vessel becomes disabled. And so the icebreaker is there and is available to lend a tow. As far as using contracted ice breaker vessels, unless it's sort of aligned with a route like the Northwest Passage, for example, I mean, I think that could happen where, I mean, there's some other issues with commercializing the Northwest Passage, including some dredge, but I don't see why Canada and other littoral states could decide that they're going to put out a request for proposals for private ice-breaking services to service a particular area. But candidly, right now, I think the Northwest, the Northern Sea Route is really the best game and the biggest game in town. Now, sanctions may change some of that, but that's the biggest game in town. So I don't see that happening that much in the near future, where it would be that profitable for private icebreaking.
Terrific. Thank you for that clarification and analysis there, Mark. Heidi, I think this is one for you. We have a question about, obviously, as Ambassador Mann has mentioned, the Arctic is not empty. There are millions of people living in the Arctic who call it their home. Many have done so for for a very long time. And Indigenous concerns are a particular issue in the Arctic. You'll see it throughout strategy documents, of course, at least in the Western strategy documents that I've read. Did you notice anything about Chinese firms or Chinese government talking about their intention or ambition to minimize the negative impacts of economic investments and activity on, in particular, Indigenous populations, but all vulnerable Arctic populations writ large, and any discussion of revenue sharing or helping to generate benefits for these local communities in a way that could generate buy-in on the local level?
Yeah, thanks, Cornell, and thanks for the question. This is actually something we looked for and I kept an eye out for, and saw very little discussion of in Chinese writings or PRC writings of the potential impact on Indigenous peoples. There's a nod in the white paper to respecting the traditions and cultures of Arctic residents, including Indigenous peoples. But there's really not a whole lot of discussion in the public policy documents that we saw about trying to win the support of Indigenous people or minimize the impact of projects on them.
Perfect. Thank you for that clarification. One other question on the Global Gateway, just turning back to that, just came in. I think it's worth addressing as a clarification. One of our attendees asks, may I ask if Global Gateway considers potentially investing in the Arctic region? They suggest that only plans for Africa have been released so far. Ambassador Mann, do you have any insight into that?
It's an ongoing process. I mean, as you say, I mean, it's early days. The thing has only been out a few months, and it is this is not a sort of piece of paper where we say we are going to do the following 5 projects there, 5 projects there. It's a case of generating interest, finding investment, and it may or may not emerge. I mean, obviously, we believe that there is a need for better infrastructure in certain Arctic regions. Certainly, electronic digital infrastructure in the European part of the Arctic is pretty good, actually. But and we are hoping that through our satellite systems we can enhance that still further with 5G in the coming years. But there is a need certainly for some infrastructure. But this is something that has to come about through through private investment as well as state investment as well. So it's a moving target, if you like. It's something that will emerge or not in time. But at the moment, no, you're right. There's no Arctic projects as such.
Cornell, just for everybody's interest, in the report, there is a review of a number of the different funds that are out there, Algu Fund, and there's other, and we looked at a variety of different funds as potential sources of capital. So I would just refer folks to the report.
Yes, I believe that's in the appendix to the first report in our series of 4.
Thank you.
And then we've had a series of questions about energy and dependence. We've had questions, and I'm trying to think of a way to merge these together in the limited time that we have left, because I think it's an interesting topic. It's an interesting vein. Obviously, as Mark noted, we found that, or CNA found that energy made up a major sector for Chinese investments. And certainly energy looms large in the Arctic. So one side of the coin, I suppose, is the question of whether China really needs the oil and gas that is found in the Arctic and that it has been investing in, particularly in the Russian Arctic. So does it really need this? Perhaps we can answer that. And then on the flip side, of course, the green transition is vital as we face climate change and its repercussions. But we've had a question as well that's thought-provoking about, are we exchanging one kind of dependence in one, in our case, our current case on oil and gas for another kind, and that's on high-tech minerals, and could that create political or economic risks? Obviously, I think the questioner is thinking of Greenland and potential Chinese investment in Greenland in the context of its nascent or its ongoing, excuse me, quest for independence and greater political autonomy. I throw that one to the floor. I think that hits on a lot of different the expertise of all of our three panelists, and I'm happy to let the first one to unmute fire first.
I can jump in there if you like.
Okay.
I mean, I'd like to touch on the mineral side, actually, to be honest. I mean, it is true. I mean, the starting point for the European Union is we need this double transition away from hydrocarbons and towards the sort of minerals, the sort of green energy for which you need these minerals. And indeed, currently, we are highly dependent on China and a number of, let's say, less stable states for some of these minerals. A report that came out last month from the Nordic Council of Ministers found that they believe that the sort of volumes of these minerals that we need for the European Union are actually available in Northern Europe, potentially. Now, clearly, Greenland is a potentially big source of this, and so far we've seen investment mainly from China and Australia in Greenland, and we are trying to encourage. I mean, the thing is, the European Union as an outfit has limited competences. It doesn't grant licenses to mine, but we are trying to sort of encourage European operators to go there and mine these minerals to increase our strategic autonomy. Greenland obviously has a special status. It's part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but it's not part of the European Union. But I think the way that we can really help this process is by establishing, because it's very important. You mentioned earlier the indigenous peoples. It's very important that we do these things in a sensitive way, because this mining is always a controversial issue. So we can set very, very strict environmental but also social standards for this mining to respect livelihoods and ways of life, and hopefully we can stimulate companies from Europe to go there, or from the US, or wherever it may be, because we do need to break the sort of stranglehold and the strategic dependence we have on certain countries. And this transition is inevitable. I mean, the European Union has set great store by its Green Deal to be the first carbon neutral continent by 2050, and hopefully earlier than that. And this transition with the use of minerals needs to happen, and we can't have a situation again where we find ourselves at the moment with certain of our member states highly dependent on Russian gas. We need to be at least as autonomous as we can be in the future. And this whole Ukraine crisis has actually spurred the European Union to, as you probably noticed, to develop a rather accelerated change in its energy policies to really determinedly drive the green transition and to drive a move away from dependence on Russian gas. So hopefully, they say that the European Union makes sort of great spurts in its development in times of crisis, and I think this is a good example of that, to be honest.
I'd like to make a couple of comments. First off, I understand the European community wants to sort of to move away from Russian gas, but I will say, if you look at the data, the seismic data, there is a tremendous amount of natural gas up there in the Arctic, even in the US, in the Chukchi Sea, which Shell was seeking to develop and then abandoned plans 4 or 5 years ago. I understand that folks want to move completely to alternative energy forms, but I mean, natural gas is something of a bridge fuel. It's far better than coal-fired plants. And so I think, I mean, I do think long-term, the Arctic is going to be very, very important. And I think a lot of that's going to be driven, not necessarily by the oil reserves per se, but it's going to be because of the large gas reserves that are up there. So that's point one, including in the US, in the Chukchi Sea, very large deposits. Secondly, on the point of minerals, I mean, my understanding is that rare earth minerals are associated often with uranium mining or uranium deposits, and that there are rare earth mineral deposits in some abundance in Greenland. And I mean, it's no secret that China has, I'm not going to call it a cartel, but they have substantial market share in rare earth minerals. And we've seen how important those are, you know, in cell phones and everything else. They're ubiquitous. And so, I mean, I can't recall exactly what the question is, but there will be other minerals up there that will take on prominence and significance. And I think rare earth minerals will remain, also in the case of Greenland, something that will be contested. Militarily, no, but economically, yes.
Hey, Cornell, I'd like to add something as well. I think somewhere in there was the question, can the PRC do without the oil and gas resources in the Arctic? Maybe they could, but from their perspective, they really view those resources as vital. A significant portion of the white paper is devoted to discussing China's desire to participate in the development of Arctic resources. I mean, they've been very public and very clear about how strategically important they view those resources. Chinese government affiliated analysts have talked about the global strategic importance of Arctic oil and gas reserves. I mean, China has been the largest importer of the world's largest oil importer since at least 2017. And it's constantly concerned about how to, you know, maintain those energy resources and the access it needs to continue to fuel its economic growth. So even if it were try to shift to greener sources of energy, it also views the Arctic as important to that as well. I mean, the white paper talks about geothermal, wind, and other clean energy resources in the Arctic. So I think the idea that I think regardless going forward, the PRC is going to continue to be interested in developing Arctic energy resources in any way, shape, or form. It's going to want to be part of that. So, over. Thank you.
Terrific, and not just as a presence, but as a material benefit for China's economy. Terrific. Well, thank you, Heidi, for that answer. And again, I'm glad that we were able to find a question and phrase it in such a way that all three of you were able to make such a substantial contribution to my understanding and hopefully the understanding of our audience as well. I think we are coming towards the end of our allotted time. And I want to turn, I guess, finally to the question of cooperation, the theme of our national security seminar as we go forward with 2022. And hopefully there will be many more opportunities for cooperation between the US and its allies and partners, as well as other countries. And this perhaps is a little bit more of an open question, and that is, what kind of cooperation do you think would do most to improve the US and the EU's interests in the Arctic that currently isn't happening, or perhaps isn't happening strongly enough, or perhaps, Ambassador Mann, you'll have a type of cooperation that is not talked often enough about that you'd like to highlight?
Well, the range of our cooperation is actually already very, very large, actually. I mean, it started, we started in the Arctic with research diplomacy, basic research cooperation, but it's really gone beyond that. And I think the sort of unfortunately, of course, the world's attention is elsewhere now. But I think the sort of the stars were aligned a little bit. We have an administration in Washington that sees very much eye to eye with the leadership in Europe. So I think, you know, there is, and there was, and hopefully there will still be much you know, possibility to sort of fight and mitigate climate change together, to try and move towards this green transition together, and to try and find common ways of stimulating economic development in the Arctic. I think we do actually see eye to eye very much. And, you know, unfortunately, our attention is elsewhere at the moment. But as I said before, the most important thing of all is that we don't allow this terrible situation in Ukraine to allow us to drop the important work that we're doing, because it's too important. I mean, there are great, I mean, the Arctic regions are not only in need of green solutions for themselves, but the problems that are happening in the Arctic regions are not caused by the people who live in the Arctic, it's caused by the people who live south of the Arctic Circle. And so we see the Arctic, if you like, as a sort of test bed to develop technologies that can then be exported. And I think there's so much scientific expertise in both the US and in Canada and the European Union. And also there's a great deal of sort of, you know, diplomatic agreement on this as well. So I just think that, you know, it's a terrible old cliche, but the sort of win-win situation. We can actually use the Arctic, work together in the Arctic to kind of develop technologies that can be used elsewhere for everybody's benefit.
Thank you, Ambassador Mann. Mark, do you want to jump in with a desired form of cooperation?
Yeah, I guess I would approach it. I'm not to take away from what you said, Ambassador Mann, but I think the one area which I focused on is, are the Arctic states able to realize their own national objectives in terms of developing their own resources and maintaining their own economic sovereignty? And some of this came up in the literature as well as in the interviews, that there are folks in Iceland, there's folks in Greenland, and some also in Canada, I probably dare say United States, that feel that they lack access to capital, investment capital, and I would say patient investment capital that understands the unique risks of being able to develop, or excuse me, to launch a project in the Arctic. And so, you know, when I think of the need for cooperation, one of the recommendations of the report was the notion of an Arctic Development Bank. I think cooperation in that area is very, very important. So these individuals don't have to turn to China to get investment capital. Okay, more sources are coming online, but it's still, I think it would be highly beneficial if capital was much more available for the countries that want to be able to, you know, determine their own economic fate.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. Heidi, anything from the economic statecraft perspective, perhaps?
Just a consideration going forward for any cooperation on financing Arctic projects would be the extent to which countries want or don't want the PRC involved. I think that's going to be a factor going forward, and ensuring that that countries are aware of the potential downsides to accepting PRC investment. Those are just factors to keep in mind.
Terrific. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ambassador Mann. We are now just over time, and I apologize in my sort of the dereliction of my duty as the moderator to bring us to harbor by 11:45 Eastern time. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their expertise and insights with us today. I want to thank all of you who are calling in or Zooming in for participating in today's seminar. We could not have done it without the terrific questions that you posed in our Q&A box. And we hope that this is the first of many times that we'll have the opportunity to engage with you this year. If you're new to CNA, and if you're a longtime listener or attendee of our events, we're so glad to have you back. As we mentioned in the chat, we will be disseminating a link to the recording once it's available, as well as links to some of CNA's recent work on the topic. Thank you all very much and have a great rest of your day.